Welcome back to the deep dive. You know how it is? Sometimes you got that article bookmarked. You swear you'll read it, but life keeps getting in the way.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And, well, today we're tackling one of those pieces that could really change things up. It's called Can You Change on Your Own? Understanding Philippians 2.13. And it digs into the idea of personal transformation, especially in the context of Christianity.
It's so interesting because this article, it really kind of throws down the gauntlet, doesn't
Yeah.
it? We're always hearing that you can be anything you set your mind to.
Yeah.
But what if real change actually comes from somewhere else completely?
Right. It starts off by hitting us right where we live, I feel like. With that feeling of wanting to change, but constantly falling short. We've all been there. New Year's resolutions. Anyone.
Exactly. And it acknowledges that even for people of faith, this struggle is real.
Yeah.
They might feel like they should have it all together.
Yeah.
But change is just plain hard.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting and thought-provoking. The article digs into Philippians 2.13.
Okay.
And some translations say, "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose."
Mm-hmm.
Other translations put it as, "God is working in you, giving you the desire and the power to do what pleases him." And talk about a perspective.
So it's not just about me mustering up enough willpower. I mean, that's kind of a relief. But also, what does that even mean?
Practically.
Well, the article argues that relying solely on our own strength, that's often why we fail.
Okay.
We make those promises to ourselves. I'll never eat another donut.
Yep.
But then we end up face first in a box by Tuesday.
Exactly.
So this verse suggests that maybe transformation, it's not about self-effort, but about aligning ourselves with something much bigger.
Okay, but doesn't that make us sound kind of passive?
Right?
Are we just supposed to sit back and wait for God to zap us into perfect being?
Not quite.
Okay.
The article actually uses this really cool analogy of God as a gardener.
He's removing the weeds, our harmful desires, and planting good seeds, his desires, in their place. It's not that we're doing nothing, it's that we're recognizing where true change really originates.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Right.
So where do we fit in then?
Right. It's not just about passively waiting for a makeover. The article outlines a few practical steps for aligning ourselves with this divine power.
Okay.
Things like asking for forgiveness, immersing ourselves in Scripture, especially verses that speak to the areas we want to change,
Okay.
and surrounding ourselves with teachings that echo these truths.
So it's like setting the stage for transformation.
Yeah.
Creating the right conditions for growth, but recognizing we're not in total control of the process.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The article suggests that even our failures can play a role in transformation.
Wait, seriously, I thought the whole point was to stop failing.
Of course, we don't want to mess up. But the article argues that when we do, and let's be real, we all do,
Yeah.
it actually throws us back onto God's strength. Remember 2 Corinthians 3.5. Not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God. Each stumble, it becomes a reminder that we're not in this alone.
So it's less about beating ourselves up for messing up and more about seeing those moments as opportunities to rely on something greater than ourselves.
Precisely. It's a completely different way of framing the whole change process. And this leads us to the idea that transformation, it isn't an overnight event, but a journey. The article stresses trusting that even when we don't see instant results, God is still at work.
Yeah, it reminds me of that saying, life is a marathon, not a sprint. But in this case, it's a marathon with a divine coach, cheering us on every step of the way. It's about the long game.
Right. And the article even gave this example about someone who realized they hadn't argued with their spouse in months, whereas before it was a daily occurrence.
Yeah.
And they didn't even notice this shift at first.
Yeah.
Because it happened so gradually.
Wow, that's powerful. So often we're looking for that instant dramatic transformation. But real change can be so subtle, almost like a seed sprouting underground. You don't see it at first, but it's working its way up to the surface.
Exactly. And the article ties this into the concept of sanctification,
Okay.
which for those who might not be familiar, is the idea of being progressively transformed into the likeness of Christ. It's a journey, not a destination. And it's not about achieving some kind of flawless perfection.
So it's not about becoming a robot who never makes mistakes, but about becoming more like the best version of ourselves, but empowered by something beyond just our own willpower.
That's a great way to put it. And this challenges that whole individualistic self-improvement mindset that's so pervasive today. Instead of white-knuckling our way to change, It's about surrendering to a power greater than
But
ourselves.
doesn't that take the pressure off? If we're constantly trying to force ourselves to change, it's exhausting. What if it's not about striving in our own strength, but about tapping into something much bigger?
That's a key point the article makes. And remember those practical steps we talked about earlier: seeking forgiveness, diving into Scripture, immersing ourselves in teachings that resonate with this idea. These are all ways we create space for transformation to occur. It's not passive. It's an active choice to align ourselves with God's work.
Okay, so maybe instead of that self-made narrative, it's more like we're collaborating with God in the process of becoming who we're meant to be.
I like that. It's a partnership. And as we surrender to that partnership, our desires begin to align with God's desires. And that's where true freedom comes from.
Freedom from that constant internal battle, from trying to force ourselves into a mold that doesn't quite fit.
You got it. And the article reminds us that this alignment with God's will, it actually brings about the very things we've been striving for: peace, joy, love, patience. Those are some of the fruits of the Spirit mentioned in Galatians 5:22-23.
Hold on, for folks who might not be as familiar with the Bible, could you unpack that a bit? What are these fruits, and why are they important here?
Good point. In this context, fruits refer to the character traits that naturally flow from a life connected to God. Things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. They're not things we force, but qualities that grow organically as we align ourselves with God's Spirit.
So it's not just about eliminating bad habits, it's about cultivating a whole new way of being.
Precisely. And that's why this article, even though it's focused on one specific Bible verse, it has such broad implications. It speaks to that universal desire for a life that's more meaningful, more fulfilling.
It's like offering a totally different roadmap for personal growth.
Yeah.
One that's less about gritting our teeth and pushing harder, and more about surrendering to something that can transform us from the inside out.
Exactly. It's a radical departure from the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality.
Okay, I have to ask. If someone's listening to this and they're like, this all sounds amazing, but I'm still struggling with this specific bad habit or negative thought pattern, what's the bridge between these big ideas and the nitty-gritty of daily life? How do we actually make this work?
That's such a great question. And I think the key is remembering that transformation is a process, not a switch we flip. It's about those small, consistent steps in the right direction. Like the article says, we can saturate ourselves in Scripture, especially verses that address our specific struggles.
So it's about intentionally feeding our minds, our hearts, with words that point us toward this kind of change.
Exactly. And it's about prayer, too. Not just asking for forgiveness, but actively inviting God into the process, surrendering our will to His, and asking Him to work in us.
So it's not just a mental exercise. It's about a real relationship with God, one where He's actively involved in our transformation.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the true power lies. When we connect with that love, that desire for our wholeness, that's when real change begins to happen.
So it's amazing how we started by talking about that like universal struggle with change. And now we've landed on this idea that true transformation, it might actually come from a source completely outside of ourselves.
It is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? The less we try to force it, the more open we become to real change.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, let go and let God. But what does that actually look like in real life?
The article points us back to Philippians 2:13. It reminds us that we're not meant to go it alone. And this really connects to a core message of Christianity, that we can actually have a relationship with a God who loves us and wants the best for us.
So it's not about earning God's love or trying to be good enough to deserve this transformation.
Not at all. It's about receiving it as a gift. And that's where faith comes in, trusting that even when we don't see it, God is working in us.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. For the listener who's really resonating with these ideas, maybe even feeling that spark of hope, but also a little overwhelmed, what's the one thing we want them to walk away with?
That transformation is possible, but it might not look like what we expect. It's less about our own striving and more about aligning ourselves with God's work in us.
Beautifully put. So much to think about. If true change starts with God, what does it mean for us to surrender our will to His? And what's one small step we can take today to invite that transformation into our lives?
Those are great questions. And I hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives to consider.
Yeah.
I encourage you to go back and revisit the article. Maybe even read the whole chapter of Philippians 2. There are so many resources out there to help you explore this idea of transformation even further.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic. Until then, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep